So, it's the late 1920s. The Soviet Union is a fresh new experiment in building a workers' paradise run by a man with a famously warm and trusting personality, Joseph Stalin. Having consolidated power, he looked around and decided the USSR needed to industrialize. Fast. Like, build entire cities yesterday fast. This required money, which required exports, and the most valuable export they had was grain. The only problem was that this grain was grown by millions of Ukrainian peasants who, rather selfishly, also enjoyed eating. This presented a logistical challenge for Stalin's grand vision, a vision that treated human beings as a rounding error in a 5-year plan. Meanwhile, Ukraine was experiencing a cultural renaissance, a policy called Ukrainianization, where the language and arts flourished, a strong national identity. You can probably see where this is going. Stalin's solution was a stroke of bureaucratic genius called collectivization. The idea was simple: take all the private farms and combine them into massive, state-run super farms called kolkhozes. This was pitched as being way more efficient, because everyone knows that people work hardest when their land is taken away and they're forced to work for a distant, faceless committee. To lead this glorious agricultural revolution, 25,000 zealous but agriculturally clueless party activists were sent from the cities. They were great at quoting Marx, less great at knowing when to plant things. The Ukrainian peasants, who had been farming this land for centuries, resisted. The most successful farmers were labeled kulaks, a supposedly rich, exploitative class. In reality, it was a label slapped on anyone with 2 cows and a sliver of ambition. These kulaks were to be liquidated as a class, a wonderfully sterile term for mass deportation, execution, and expropriation of everything they owned. With the most competent farmers removed, the state then imposed impossible grain quotas. In 1930, the Soviet state requisitioned 30% of Ukraine's harvest. By 1931, it was 41.5%. For 1932, the plan was to extract 7.7 million tons, a fantasy number that the shattered agricultural system could never produce. When the impossible quotas weren't met, search brigades were sent in. These weren't just guys asking nicely, they were armed teams who used long metal rods to probe the ground, walls, and ovens, searching for any hidden cache of food. They took everything. Not just the grain for the state, but the seed for the next harvest, the vegetables in the cellar, the last jar of pickles. Then, in August 1932, came the Decree on the Protection of Socialist Property, nicknamed the Law of Spikelets. This made picking a few leftover stalks of wheat from a harvested field, something peasants had done for centuries to survive, an act of treason punishable by a decade in a gulag, or death. The state had officially declared war on hungry children. By winter 1932, mass starvation had begun. People started to flee their villages in search of food in the cities. The state's response was not to send aid, but to double down. In January 1933, a directive signed by Stalin and Molotov explicitly banned peasants from Ukraine and the Cuban region from leaving. The borders were sealed by military detachments. It was a prison camp the size of France. An internal passport system, introduced at the same time, meant that anyone caught trying to travel without papers was either arrested or simply sent back to their village to die. They weren't just allowing the famine to happen, they were curating it, managing it, ensuring maximum efficiency. The goal was clear: to break the will of the Ukrainian peasantry, the very backbone of the Ukrainian nation. It's one thing to have a famine, it's another to build a wall around it. What happened next is a place where sarcasm fails. By the spring of 1933, a terrifying silence fell over the Ukrainian countryside. The villages were filled with the dead and the dying. People ate anything they could find: grass, tree bark, leather, pets. There are thousands of documented official Soviet records of cannibalism, parents eating their children, neighbors hunting neighbors. People would lie down to sleep and simply not wake up. Blacklists were posted in villages that failed to meet grain quotas, meaning no goods of any kind could be sold there, a deliberate death sentence. At its peak in June 1933, an estimated 28,000 people were dying of starvation every single day in Ukraine. That's over 1,000 people an hour. While this was happening, Soviet grain silos nearby were full, with much of it being exported abroad for currency to fuel industrial machines. The food was there. It was just not for them. So where was the international community? Well, some were trying to report the truth. A young Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones traveled to Ukraine, witnessed the horror, and published his findings. He was immediately denounced as a liar. Leading the charge against him was the New York Times Moscow bureau chief, Walter Duranty. This man, from the comfort of his Moscow apartment, wrote articles famously stating, "There is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be." He called reports of famine malignant propaganda. For this stellar investigative work, he won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932, which the New York Times has to this day not rescinded. The Soviet state was also master of the Potemkin tour. They invited prominent Westerners, like French Prime Minister Édouard Herriot, who was taken on a carefully choreographed trip. He saw bountiful harvests on model collective farms, met happy peasants, and went home to declare that the rumors of famine were Nazi propaganda. It's amazing what you can't see when you're not supposed to be looking. By the end of 1933, the famine had largely served its purpose. Somewhere between 4 and 7 million people were dead. The peasantry was broken. But now there was a new problem: vast, empty regions of Ukraine. The solution was as chilling as the crime itself. The state organized the mass resettlement of people from Russia and Belarus into the homes of the dead. Entire villages were repopulated by outsiders who had no connection to the land. At the same time, the assault on Ukrainian identity that started with the famine continued. Hundreds of Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, priests, and artists were arrested and executed in the following years. The vibrant culture that had blossomed in the 1920s was systematically gutted. This wasn't just about grain. It was never just about grain. It was about erasing a nation from the inside out, turning one of the most fertile regions on Earth into a graveyard, and then telling the ghosts they were never there. For the next 50 years, the Holodomor, Ukrainian word meaning death by hunger, was a state secret in the Soviet Union. You could be sent to a gulag just for mentioning it. The official line was that there were some food difficulties caused by kulak saboteurs and bad weather. The 1937 Soviet census, which would have revealed the catastrophic population loss, was suppressed. Its organizers were arrested and shot, because that's what you do with inconvenient data. The truth only began to emerge during Glasnost in the late 1980s as archives were opened and survivors finally felt safe to speak. The man who coined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, specifically identified the Soviet starvation of Ukraine as a textbook example of the crime. It was, in his words, not simply a case of mass murder. It is a case of genocide, of the destruction not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation. It's a reminder that the most effective weapon of a tyrant is not just the gun, but the eraser. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!